Hi, Chao.
Hi, Nyambura.
How are you?
Fine, thank you.
It's so exciting to talk to you as always. And maybe you could start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself, how you came to your work, what your work is, and so on.
Thanks, Nyambura. My name is Chao T Maina. I'm a digital heritage specialist, an historical activist, a public historian. I think my work has evolved over the years, but the primary domain of what I do is within culture and heritage and technology and seeing where the two meet, specifically African culture and heritage. And I approached it as someone who felt that they had very little agency working in historical spaces, and my first venture into digital heritage per se was a history blog that I started in 2012. And from that point, I've just been working in history in different ways. But what was interesting for me was that as an individual, just with a blog and a platform and access to one or two archival materials, I had an audience and I had people who were willing to listen, but also not just listen to someone who was on BBC or CNN talking about African history, but to listen to me, a young Kenyan Black woman, uh, deciding that I want to be in this space and I want to share my interest. So that's what I do. I work mostly looking at historical visualizations, digitization, so digital archives, um, creation of archives in different media formats, not just like text or photographs, but also 3D data, video data. Yeah, so in summary, I'm the founder of African Digital Heritage, which is a nonprofit organization looking to basically support and encourage a more holistic and knowledge-based approach to digital solutions within African heritage. And the reason why I came up with this organization was I realized that when we look at technology and we look at culture, it's almost as if they're on two different ends of the room. And I felt that there needed to be an interface. There needed to be an organization or individual or someone working to bridge the two worlds. So that's what African Digital Heritage seeks to do in a nutshell. I'm also co-founder of the Museum of British Colonialism, which is an online volunteer initiative, a small group with a big name, working to present, disseminate, curate, and basically create a platform where we can talk about colonialism in a more truthful but also more inclusive way. And lastly, I'm a co-founder of the Open Restitution Project, which looks to build an open data platform to collate and to aggregate information on the restitution of African human remains and cultural objects.
Whew, well, I mean,
What do I say?
yeah, I'm curious about this idea of, digital archives or audiovisual archives, especially in the context of no direct flight and the fact that this is basically a film season. So what's a place of film in the archives you interact with? Is film a major component of the archival work you're doing, and what forms does it take?
I wouldn't say it's a major component of the work that I do or I create, but it is a major component of the work that I access. If that makes sense, in the sense that a lot of the footage, archival footage, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, on I would say pre-colonial Kenya and mostly pre-colonial Africa, a lot of the visual imagery that we get from that, either just the colonial period, comes from film. It comes from this photographs, but primarily from, in terms of moving image, from films that were created. And these are your safari, your travel logs, your adventure in the African wild. And it's interesting, I think, for us, for those of us who this is our only visual resource. This is one of the few visual resources that we have to picture what life was like. I think it's very interesting in the ways that we come to the archive, in the ways that we respond to it. What do we pick and what do we leave? What do we critique? What do we challenge? What do we accept? So there's so many questions around, I think, us as Africans accessing these films, where we access them, how we access them, but also how we respond, because they were never designed for us. They were never designed to accommodate us as audiences, or even as part of the filmmaking process. So there's a lot of gaps, there's a lot of misrepresentation. But then again, this is what we have, So I think understanding how we work with it and how we respond to it is really, really crucial.
I really like what you're saying about this idea that this I think, a continuing conversation even within literature, that there is a gaze, and the gaze is not the African gaze, and the gaze was not intended even to be shared with the African. We are, as a friend of mine calls it, a collateral audience. We happened to be there and we saw it, but we are not the ones the thing was made for. And this is a continuing theme, of course. And that takes me to a project you're working on right now, about this idea of people now in the 21st century responding to some of these images from the 20th century and even before, some photographs, films, and so on. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and the ways in which people are responding to this footage that exists, essentially like going up against the archive and making certain statements about it.
Yeah. With regards to film and archival footage, I was looking at how we access them now, because there are two levels of access. There's free access and there's paid access. When you look at paid access, you have your British Pathé and all these websites and platforms where you have to pay. You have to pay to access this material. And on the other hand, you have your YouTubes, which essentially are free, And I was looking at the free spaces, particularly YouTube, and what films are there on Africa, 20th century Africa, and what kind of characterizations and audiences do these films attract now that they're freely accessible? Because we have to remember that when these films were being shot, they were never even intended to be shown here on the continent, and if they were, it was only to white audiences. So we begin to see that the levels of access have changed, where this thing is freely, this films are freely available to everyone. And for me, I think what's really powerful is the ability to respond to these films. And when you go on YouTube, and for example, one of the films that I've been using is a film called Untamed Africa. And I think just by the name, you can already tell what content it's going to have. But what's interesting for me is that people are responding, to this film, even like quoting the minutes, like in this minute 40.99, the narrator said this is false because this is not even my language, this is Native American, So the idea that we're not just responding to the archive with what we feel, we're responding to it with facts, we're responding to it with our experience, we are bringing our whole self and our understanding of our individuality to the archive, And when I look at this, I look at the film and I look at the comments, I see these comments as being part of the film's archive. I see them as being part of the film's life, And I think it's interesting in the way that digital spaces are allowing us, primarily as Africans, to be able to challenge, because this narrator, when he was creating or recording the voiceover for this film, he never thought that one day someone from Zambia would be like, yo, actually that's false, But here we are today, and I think it's really powerful that we began to see these two as existing on the same level. The narrator is not here and the commenter on YouTube here, they're actually now at the same level. And we are making a contemporary archive through our crowdsourced memory, through our crowdsourced experiences.
I'd like to ask about this idea of creating a contemporary archive. What room is there for the risk there is in digital spaces of attrition, of the loss of this thing tomorrow? For instance, if the film is pulled down on YouTube, what happens then? Like, what happens to that archive that's been built? Because there is that traditional, say, film archive that's on your microfiche or your film or whatever, and it's there. Unless it's destroyed, physically destroyed, it continues to exist. But what happens when we depend on these digital spaces as the site of this popular archival process?
I think the thing with digital spaces is that, one, they are, I don't know if ephemeral is the word, but they're intangible, and they're passing by. And I think when we begin to critique like the permanence of digital spaces, then we can sometimes miss out on the impact that it has. And if today YouTube is not there, those comments most probably will not be there, unless they're archived into a separate platform. But I think for me, one of the things that I focus on is the impact that those comments have now. It's not so much even in that the comment itself is irreplaceable. It can be typed into the next platform or shared in the next space. But when I as a Kenyan, I go onto YouTube and I see someone else comment and say, that's not my language, it gives me an awakening in the sense that I will see another film somewhere and I can critique it because I saw someone else challenge it, or I saw someone else respond to it. So I think in terms of permanence, we're not working with permanence in anything. I think Corona has shown us that, utajua hujui, which basically means that life can just go anywhere, whether it's the physical world or the digital world. But I think when we look at the impact, and this potential for people to respond in future, in the sense that you're setting an example or you're seeing something done and you're like, hey, I can do that too. And I think that's what's powerful. It's not so much the permanence, but also the action and the intent behind this, because we're also looking at spaces that were not equitable spaces. So even if I went to a cinema, I would probably have not been able to speak out in that sense. So I think the power is in the sort of like the immediacy, but the power also being in that the leveling of the voices, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. It does. Because as you're saying, you are encountering both of these stories in the same place. You're not watching the film and then encountering critique at a later point. It's right there in the comment section. And that's really powerful, people speaking back to this archival footage or whatever. And then lastly, maybe let's talk a little bit about all the things you discovered, some of the things you discovered about the fine or not so fine history of film in Kenya, and then we'll wrap it up with an interesting story you unearthed during your work. But let's start with a short introduction to film in Kenya.
Oh wow! When I decided to write about history of film in Kenya, it was interesting because I thought I'm not a filmmaker, I'm a historian. So I felt that maybe there are aspects that I might miss not having a film background. But what was interesting is that I just approached it from a personal perspective, with a recollection on my first time in the cinema, which is at Kenya Cinema in Nairobi in the 90s to watch Space Jam. And I thought of myself sitting there in that cinema and how long it took for me as a young Black girl to be able to sit in the cinema. So I started deconstructing film in itself, but also cinemas as spaces of exclusion. Starting with the first film shot in Kenya, which is obviously this Roosevelt in Africa, a safari themed white man conquers the untamable African jungle kind of film. And it's so interesting because in this film, I think he films in South Africa and Kenya, but everyone is Zulu. So the Maasais are Zulu, the Kikuyus are Zulus, because we are one and the same people. After all, Africa is quote unquote a country. But this is the foundation of film in Kenya as we know it. And looking at how this has played into the different aspects of how we see ourselves, but also how Kenya is represented, as this safari magical destination, Lion King-esque, with no people but loads of animals, and we just happen to be infesting the land, and you can see where this you can see where this kind of visual imagery comes from. When you look at film, mostly during the colonial period, especially in the 1950s, you see film being used primarily in the British Empire in different parts, whether it's in Ghana, Kenya, India, being used as a propaganda tool. In the during the state of emergency, the colonial government starts an initiative which they're calling mobile cinemas. And these cinemas go around the country, but what they're used to do primarily is to sensitize or desensitize the public against the Mau Mau, and basically show Mau Mau as this savage, primitive group of people that are out to kill everyone. Because the colonial government realized very early on is that if the Mau Mau spreads to other parts of the country, whether it's Western Kenya, coastal province, Northern Kenya, then it would be much harder for them to contain their uprising. So the films and the mobile cinemas are the primary tool, especially even in central Kenya, which are being used to decenter and discredit the Mau Mau and what they're fighting for. An interesting thing that I found out was that the night before Dedan Kimathi was shot and captured, he had actually gone to attend one of these mobile cinemas that was showing an anti-Mau Mau film. And I thought it was very interesting for him, even as as a freedom fighter, as part of the Mau Mau, to be able to want to go and see, but what are they saying about us, And I can imagine that it's not just him as part of the Mau Mau who was going to see these films. Many of the people who are part of the Mau Mau, supporting the Mau Mau, were encountering these films in their villages and in their spaces. So that was really interesting for me. I think it's something that I would like to unpack further, this idea of mobile cinemas and what happened to them, what films they used to show. But it was really, really fascinating to find that out.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw this anecdote in your piece, I was like, what are the chances? But then it makes a lot of sense because, as you're saying, it's a way to empire was in a way making itself legible to people to its subjects via film, and this was a way, in a way, for him and other freedom fighters to read what empire was saying about them, but also about itself, as you point out in your piece. The British were saying something about themselves in what they thought was anti-Mau Mau propaganda. And I like this idea of also connecting this instance with what was happening across the empire, that this was not just a thing that was happening in Kenya, it was happening everywhere that colonialism was being enacted. And I imagine it's going to be the same if you study German occupation or French occupation or whatever, that there are going to be similar things about like images, film, photographs, and so on as the means by which certain ideas of empire are transmitted and, made to legitimated, essentially. Yeah. So this is so cool. I can't wait for our extended conversation because I know it's going to be pretty exciting. And yeah, any questions for me? No, no, no.
No, no, no. Not today. Next time. Next
Yes, I
time.
mean we have time the next time, but
Yeah.
this is it. I'm going to cut off the recording maybe like in a minute, so we can just smile at each other, but we need to give it like a minute.
Oh, casual laugh.
Exactly, as you do. Yeah.